Somewhere in a cave in northern Spain, a scientist is holding a human bone under a bright lamp, turning it slowly in gloved hands. And on the surface of that bone are thin, precise cut marks. Not random damage, not an animal bite. The exact same kind of cut marks you'd find on a deer bone or a boar bone, left behind by someone using a stone tool to strip meat off it. Except this bone belonged to a person, and it was found thrown into the same trash pile as the animal bones, cracked open the same way, for the same reason: marrow. Now imagine you're standing in a snowbound valley 800,000 years ago. The hunt failed, again. Your children haven't eaten in 3 days, and somewhere nearby, a rival group just lost a fight over the last usable water source. You'd like to think you know exactly what you would and wouldn't do in that moment. Most people alive today have never actually been tested against real, sustained starvation. Your ancestors were tested constantly. You'd like to believe this is rare, an isolated horror story from one strange site. It isn't. Here's the myth. Most people assume cannibalism among ancient humans is either a wild exaggeration invented by colonial explorers to slander people they didn't understand, or something so rare it barely counts as real history. Both of those ideas are partly comforting, and both of them collapse the moment you look at the actual bones. Because the archaeological record doesn't have one cannibalism site, it has dozens, spanning almost 1 million years, multiple human species, and multiple continents. Let's start at the deepest layer. At a site called Gran Dolina in the Atapuerca Mountains of Spain, archaeologists uncovered bones belonging to Homo antecessor, an early human species that lived roughly 800,000 to 900,000 years ago. The bones showed cut marks in the exact same locations, made with the exact same technique, as the animal bones found in the same layer. Skulls had been broken open. Long bones had been snapped for marrow. Researchers who studied the site described it using a specific, almost clinical term: gastronomic cannibalism. Not ritual, not desperation, just food processing, applied to a member of your own species with the same efficiency you'd apply to a deer. This wasn't an isolated incident either. It appears to have happened repeatedly, generation after generation, at the same site. Now fast forward a few 100,000 years to our closest extinct relatives, the Neanderthals. At a cave called Moula-Guercy in France, archaeologists found the remains of at least 6 Neanderthals, adults and children, showing the same unmistakable signature: cut marks from defleshing, bones deliberately fractured to extract marrow and brain tissue. The bones had been processed with the same tools and the same techniques Neanderthals used on deer and other game animals found at the same site. At El Sidrón cave, also in Spain, researchers found the remains of an entire Neanderthal family group, 12 individuals, again showing cut marks consistent with butchery. At Krapina in Croatia, a site over 100 years old in terms of excavation history, researchers found similar patterns among dozens of Neanderthal bone fragments. Whatever this behavior was, it wasn't unique to modern humans. It ran through an entire genus. And it wasn't even unique to humans in the broader sense. Cannibalism shows up across the animal kingdom far more often than most people assume. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, have been observed killing and eating infants from rival groups. Certain species of spiders and praying mantises consume their mates. Even among various rodent species, mothers under extreme nutritional stress will sometimes consume their own offspring rather than let an entire litter starve. From a purely evolutionary standpoint, cannibalism isn't some unnatural aberration that only appears when something has gone catastrophically wrong. In the right circumstances, across an enormous range of species, it's simply one more strategy for surviving scarcity or eliminating competition. Ancient humans did not invent this behavior. They inherited the biological capacity for it, the same way every other social mammal did. But here's where the story gets more complicated, because not all of this was the same kind of act, and lumping it all together misses something important. Anthropologists generally break ancient cannibalism into a few distinct categories, and the differences matter enormously. The first is survival cannibalism. This is exactly what it sounds like: extreme famine, isolation, or catastrophe, with no other food source available. This kind of cannibalism is documented well into recorded history. The Donner Party, trapped in the Sierra Nevada mountains in the winter of 1846, resorted to eating the bodies of those who had already died. Sieges throughout history, from ancient warfare to more recent conflicts, have produced grim, well-documented accounts of the same desperate choice. This form of cannibalism isn't really about culture or belief. It's about a starving body doing whatever it takes to keep functioning for one more day. The second category is funerary or ritual cannibalism, sometimes called endocannibalism, meaning the consumption of someone from your own community, usually a relative, as part of a mourning or burial practice rather than as an ordinary meal. This has been documented in multiple traditional societies, including certain groups in the Amazon and in Papua New Guinea. The idea, at least as understood by researchers who have studied these communities directly, wasn't hostility or hunger. It was closeness. Consuming a small part of a deceased loved one was, in some of these traditions, considered a way of keeping that person's spirit or essence within the community rather than letting the body simply decompose in the ground, away from everyone who loved them. And this brings us to one of the strangest and most consequential stories in the entire history of medicine. Among the Fore people of Papua New Guinea, funerary cannibalism was practiced into the 20th century, well within living memory. Women in particular would consume the brain tissue of deceased relatives as part of mourning rituals. And starting in the 1950s, researchers noticed something disturbing. A mysterious, always fatal neurological disease was spreading through Fore communities. It was called Kuru. Victims lost muscle control, developed uncontrollable tremors, and eventually died, usually within a year of the first symptoms. It took years of research to figure out what was actually happening. Kuru wasn't caused by a virus or bacteria in the traditional sense. It was caused by a misfolded protein called a prion, the same category of infectious agent responsible for mad cow disease. And it spread specifically because the brain tissue being consumed sometimes belonged to people who already carried these misfolded proteins. Eating human brain tissue was, quite literally, transmitting a fatal disease from one person to the next, generation after generation, through an act of love and mourning. Once the practice stopped, Kuru essentially disappeared. It remains one of the most direct, documented examples in modern history of a cultural practice creating its own epidemic. The third category is what happened at Gran Dolina and possibly some of the Neanderthal sites. Predatory or gastronomic cannibalism, where members of one group treated members of another group, sometimes even a rival human species, as a food source in essentially the same way they treated any other animal. Some researchers have proposed that certain Neanderthal cannibalism cases might not even have been Neanderthal on Neanderthal violence, but instead evidence of early Homo sapiens groups consuming Neanderthals as competition for resources intensified between the two species. The evidence for this specific theory remains debated, but the underlying pattern, treating a rival hominin as prey, is not implausible given what we know about resource competition in the ancient world. So why does the thought of any of this feel so uniquely horrifying, more horrifying than the idea of eating almost any other animal? Here's where it gets genuinely interesting from an evolutionary standpoint. Researchers studying disgust responses have found that cannibalism triggers a distinct, unusually intense reaction across virtually every human culture ever studied, stronger and more consistent than disgust toward most other taboo foods. And there's a compelling biological reason this specific taboo might have been selected for so strongly. Eating members of your own species carries a uniquely dangerous biological risk that eating other animals doesn't. Diseases, particularly certain types of infectious proteins and pathogens, transmit far more efficiently between members of the same species than they do across species lines. Kuru is the most vivid, well-documented proof of exactly this mechanism in action. A population that developed and maintained a powerful aversion to consuming their own kind would have had a measurable survival advantage over populations that didn't, especially across the tens of thousands of years, where any given group might occasionally be tempted, out of desperation or opportunity, to do exactly what happened at Gran Dolina. In other words, the visceral horror you feel at the idea of cannibalism might not be purely cultural. It might be a leftover instinct, a biological alarm system, refined over hundreds of thousands of years, specifically calibrated to protect you from a disease transmission risk your ancestors couldn't have understood in scientific terms, but could absolutely feel in their gut. And the fact that it clearly wasn't always this way, the fact that Gran Dolina exists, that Moula-Guercy exists, that entire Neanderthal family groups were processed exactly like game animals, tells you something uncomfortable about how thin the line actually was. Under the right pressure, in the right ancient moment, that alarm system wasn't always strong enough to override hunger. Modern humans didn't inherit some ancient civilized restraint that ancient humans lacked. If anything, the opposite may be true. The revulsion you feel now may be the accumulated result of countless earlier populations who didn't feel it strongly enough and paid for it with Kuru, with disease, with entire family groups wiped out from the inside by whatever they had eaten. So the next time that instinctive wave of disgust hits you at even the idea of this topic, that's not squeamishness. That's roughly a million years of evolutionary pressure, quietly doing exactly the job it was shaped to do. It's strange to think that one of the most basic feelings you carry, that immediate recoil, that gut-level refusal, is itself a kind of fossil, not made of bone, but of behavior, passed down not through teaching, but through the simple fact that the ancestors who felt it strongly enough were the ones who survived to have children, and the ones who didn't feel it strongly enough, in some cave in Spain or Croatia or Papua New Guinea, often didn't. You didn't choose this reaction. You inherited it, the same way you inherited your fear of the dark, or the shape of your hands. It was built by exactly the same brutal process that built everything else about you.